Hello guys, welcome to Bedtime Sleepy. Settle in and let the night take you somewhere. America, 1850. Look at this map. Gold was found in California and word travelled fast. For most families, life was already a struggle. Farmers who couldn't make the land pay anymore. Widows stretched thin. Young men working long hours for almost nothing. Then President Polk stood up before Congress and said it himself. That was a suff. 90,000 people left in 1849 alone, by sea, by land, across mountains and open desert. Some chased gold, some ran from poverty, some just refused to live the same hard year over again. Different reasons, one belief, that somewhere ahead, life could be better. This is their story. The house was empty before dawn, not because of a fire, not because of a storm rolling in off the plains, not because of any disaster a person could name and grieve and make sense of. The house was empty because they chose to leave it. They walked out before the sun had fully risen, before the neighbours could see, and somewhere on the kitchen table they left a key, a small iron key, that nobody ever came back to claim. It sat there for months, maybe years, in the silence of a home that was no longer a home, while the people who had built their entire lives inside those four walls walked away into the dark. Across America in the years surrounding 1850, this same scene played out tens of thousands of times. It happened on worn-out farms in Ohio and Indiana, where the soil had been worked to nothing and crop yields had been falling for a decade. It happened in the cramped boarding houses of Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, where men and women worked 14-hour days in cotton mills for wages that barely covered the cost of a meal. It happened in the freezing tenements of New York City, where immigrant families from Ireland and Germany and Scandinavia had arrived with nothing and discovered quickly and painfully that the streets weren't paved with gold. They were paved with mud and horse manure and the quiet, grinding disappointment of 1,000 broken promises. These people left, not in a trickle, not gradually. They left in a wave that stunned the country, a great human tide that moved westward with a force that had no parallel in American history. In 1848, the non-native, non-military population of California sat somewhere around 14,000 souls. By the end of 1849, that number had exploded past 100,000. By 1852, more than 300,000 people had made the journey, from every state in the Union and from nations across the globe. They came from Ireland, still bleeding from the wounds of the Great Famine. They came from China, drawn by a California they called Gamsan, Gold Mountain. They came from Mexico and Chile, from Australia and Germany, from France and the Sandwich Islands, all of them converging on a single stretch of Sierra Nevada foothills, because a man named James Marshall had looked down at the water in a sawmill ditch on January 24th, 1848, and seen something glittering in the mud. That one cold January morning at Sutter's Mill on the American River set off the largest voluntary mass migration of the 19th century. But here's the thing about great historical events that textbooks almost never get right. The thing that made them happen wasn't the event itself. It wasn't the gold. The gold was the trigger. The powder had been packed into the barrel for years before the spark ever arrived. Most people don't realise that the majority of those who left their homes in 1850 weren't driven by greed or wanderlust or any romantic idea of frontier adventure. They were driven by something far more basic, far more human, far more desperate than that. They were driven by the fact that the life they were already living had stopped working. The farm wasn't producing. The mill job had been cut. The debt had grown too large to see over. The children were getting thinner. And then somebody passed through town saying there was gold in California. Free gold. Gold in the streams and the riverbeds and the hillsides, just waiting for anyone willing to make the journey. And people believed it, not because they were foolish, but because they were running out of options. And the human mind, when it runs out of options, becomes extraordinarily willing to believe in the one that remains. This is the story of why they left. And it's not a simple story. It's not a triumphant one either. Not entirely. It's a story about hunger in all its forms. Hunger for food, hunger for dignity, hunger for a future that didn't feel like a punishment for crimes you couldn't remember committing. It's a story about what happens when the promise a nation makes to its people starts to come apart, and what ordinary men and women do when they decide they can't afford to wait for someone else to fix it. Think about what it actually felt like to live in America in 1848. To be a farmer in western Ohio whose father had broken ground on land meant to sustain 3 generations, but whose harvest had shrunk every single year for the past 5. To be a mill worker in Lowell, Massachusetts, who had moved there from a New Hampshire farm at 16 to earn wages, and discovered at 25 that those wages barely covered the rent on the company's own boarding house. To be an Irish immigrant in the 5 Points neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, who had crossed an ocean to escape starvation, and arrived to find that starvation simply wore different shapes here. These weren't extraordinary circumstances. These were the ordinary circumstances of working American life in the late 1840s. And the gold rush landed in this world like a lit match dropped in dry grass. There was a woman named Lucina Stanley Wilson. She lived in Missouri in 1849, a wife and mother with 2 small children and a husband whose farm sat at the edge of ruin. She wasn't famous. She had no particular connections, no fortune, no plan. She was, by any measure, an ordinary American woman living through an extraordinary American moment. And one spring morning she looked at the wagon they'd decided to load and pointed it west, thinking, with a clarity she described years later as almost violent in its simplicity, that either California would save them or nothing would. What strikes me most is that she didn't say it with hope. She said it with the cold, clear certainty of someone who'd already run out of other choices. We'll return to Lucina, because her story is the kind that doesn't fade when you close the history book. It stays with you, in the quiet, in the way a good story does when it finds something true. But first, you need to understand the world those people were living in when they made the decision to leave it behind. You need to feel the weight of 1850 America pressing down on the people who were still inside it. The cold, the hunger, the particular despair of working hard your entire life and watching it amount to nothing. You need to feel what they felt before you can understand why the idea of gold in a California riverbed was enough to make a woman load 2 children into a wagon and leave the house empty before the sun came up. If you find yourself awake in the quiet hours, drawn to stories that reach through time and find something real, stay with this one. Let it settle over you. Because what happened in 1850 wasn't just a chapter in a textbook. It was one of the most profound eruptions of human longing this country has ever seen. And the questions it raises about desperation and dreams, about the cost of leaving and the price of staying, about what a person discovers about themselves when everything familiar is gone. Those questions have never stopped being asked. If this is the kind of story you want more of, stick around. This channel is built for exactly these moments, for history that gets under your skin and stays there. The house was empty before dawn. The key was on the table, and everything that comes next explains why. The morning they loaded the wagon, the oldest boy, he was barely 5, kept asking why they were taking the cooking pot but not the rocking chair. Lucina didn't have a good answer for him. There was no good answer, really. You take what you can carry, you leave behind what you can't, and somewhere in the space between what you carry and what you leave, You find out what you actually believe is worth holding on to. That's what 1850 America was forcing its most desperate citizens to decide. Not just what to put in the wagon, but what was actually worth carrying into an uncertain future. The farm tools or the family Bible, the extra set of clothes or the instruments of a trade you'd have to practice differently somewhere else. These weren't abstract questions. They were immediate, physical, consequential decisions made by ordinary people in ordinary farmhouse kitchens in the cold before dawn, while the children were still asleep and the oxen were stamping in the yard. Every wagon that rolled west in 1849 and 1850 was a kind of answer to that question, and the answers were as varied as the people giving them. A physician from Cincinnati packed his medical bag first and built everything else around it, understanding that whatever California turned out to be, there would be sick people in it. A blacksmith from Virginia packed his tools with a care that bordered on reverence, because the tools weren't just instruments of trade. They were the physical record of 20 years of skill, and skill was the one thing the trail couldn't take from him. A widow from Pennsylvania packed her late husband's surveying equipment, though she didn't know how to use it, because she understood instinctively that what California was going to need was people who could measure and record and establish the legal foundations of ownership that would make permanence possible. These people weren't romantics. They weren't chasing gold in any simple or naive sense. They were making considered bets with the materials available to them, in a moment when the alternative to betting was a future too narrow and too certain to accept. Smell the wood smoke first. That's what you notice before anything else in 1848 America, the smoke. It rises from every chimney on every street, in every town and settlement from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the known frontier. It clings to coats and hair and curtains and skin. It's the smell of a country still built around fire. Fire for heat, fire for cooking, fire for light, fire for the industry just beginning to reshape its eastern cities. In the mill towns of New England, the smoke runs darker, heavier, tinged with the sharp bite of coal and machine grease. In the farm country of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, it's cleaner, softer, smelling of hickory and applewood. But it's always there, and it tells you immediately that you've arrived somewhere else entirely. You're in a country that hasn't yet learned to be comfortable. The year is 1848. America is a young nation of startling contradictions. It's just fought a war with Mexico and won, its borders now stretching in a vast theoretical sweep from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But its actual settlement, its real human presence, barely extends past the Missouri River. Everything west of that river is, in the language of the time, simply the West, a word carrying almost mythological weight. The West is where you go when everywhere else has failed you. It's the American wilderness, the frontier, the open territory that keeps receding no matter how far you chase it. But in 1848, for most Americans, the West isn't yet a destination. It's a rumor. The country most people actually inhabit is cramped, familiar, and often brutal in its limitations. In the farming regions of the Midwest, life follows a rhythm so old and so demanding, it has the quality of a natural force. You wake before sunrise. In winter, the temperature inside the farmhouse might be barely above freezing by morning. You pull on clothes stiff with cold and go out to tend to animals that need tending, whether you're sick or tired or heartbroken or not. The work never stops. It simply changes shape with the seasons, planting in spring, cultivating through summer, harvesting in fall, surviving through winter on what you managed to put away. If the harvest was good, you eat. If it wasn't, and in the late 1840s, in many parts of the country, it increasingly wasn't, you figure out how to eat less. The kitchen of a Midwestern farmhouse in this era is a specific kind of place. The floor is packed dirt or rough-cut planks. The hearth dominates one wall, a large blackened opening with iron pots hanging from chains of varying lengths. The table is often a single wide plank resting on sawhorses, wooden trenchers in the poorest households, tin plates in the middling ones. The smell is rendered lard and wood ash, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. And underneath all of that, faintly but persistently, damp earth and the particular warmth of a house full of people through a long winter. You can see your breath some mornings, even inside. The children sleep in a pile for warmth, and you listen to them from the other side of the curtain that divides the sleeping space from the main room. You count their breaths, automatically, the way mothers always do, making sure every breath is there. This isn't squalor. This is ordinary life for a significant portion of the American population, and it's a life of extraordinary physical difficulty, organized entirely around one relentless imperative: production, food for the family, feed for the animals, firewood for the hearth, water hauled up from the well. There's no gap between survival and labour. They are the same thing. The soil in older farming regions is the great unspoken crisis of this era. In places like Western Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Ohio and Indiana first settled 2 and 3 generations back. The land has been worked hard and given back almost nothing in return. The farming methods of the time left fields depleted in ways nobody then had the scientific vocabulary to fully describe. They only knew the results. Corn yields that would have seemed thin to a farmer's grandfather now represented a good season. The fields were tired, and so were the people working them. In the mill towns, the exhaustion is different in texture, but identical in depth. Lowell, Massachusetts, the pride of American industrialization, looks impressive from the outside. The red brick mills rise 4 and 5 stories above the Merrimack River, turning the water's power into textile production on a scale that would have seemed miraculous 20 years before. Step inside one of those buildings and you understand what the miracle costs. The air is thick with cotton lint that gets into your lungs and never entirely leaves. The noise of the machinery, the clattering looms, the endless mechanical roar, is so constant and so complete that workers develop a kind of temporary deafness by day's end. They stand at their stations for 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. A female mill worker in the late 1840s earns around $2 a week, sometimes less. And out of that, room and board at the company's own boarding house takes the largest share. You live in a small room with 5 other women. You eat at a long table with 30 more. You work until the bells say you can stop. Then you go back to that small room and try to sleep before the bells call you back. What's remarkable is that this wasn't considered a crisis at the time. It was just considered life. That slow, grinding compression of an existence with no visible exits. And then there are the cities. New York in 1848 is already a place of contradictions so vast they seem almost impossible. Broadway gleams with gaslight and prosperity. Carriages, top hats, shop windows full of imported goods. But 3 blocks east, in the tenement warrens of the 5 Points neighborhood, the density of human desperation is almost incomprehensible. Irish immigrants, newly arrived and still carrying the weight of the famine, crowd into rooms where multiple families share a single floor. Sanitation is minimal. Water is often contaminated. Cholera and typhus move through these neighborhoods with efficient, indifferent cruelty. The streets smell of horse manure and garbage, and on hot summer days the Hudson River at low tide. A smell that presses against you like something physical, something you carry home in your clothes and can't entirely wash out. For all these people, the exhausted Ohio farmer, the mill worker in Lowell, the the immigrant family in the 5 Points. America isn't a dream. It's a daily reality of extraordinary difficulty. And they know, the way people close to the edge always know, that the margin between survival and collapse is thinner than it looks from the outside. Much thinner, and it's been narrowing for years. When word of gold starts filtering east in late 1848 and early 1849, it lands in this world. Not in a world of comfortable people looking for adventure, in a world of tired people looking for a way out. That distinction matters more than almost anything else about what follows, because it explains not just the scale of the migration, but the particular quality of desperation and hope that fueled it. The people heading west in 1849 and 1850 aren't adventurers mostly. They're Americans who've used up every other option they could think of, standing in that cold farmhouse kitchen in Missouri. Luzanna Stanley Wilson knows exactly what that feels like. She's been living it. The question is whether she has the nerve to do something about it. And that is a question with consequences she can't yet fully see. The food of this era is worth pausing on, because what a civilization puts on its people's tables tells you more about those people than almost anything else. In the farmhouses of the Ohio Valley in the late 1840s, a winter meal was often salt pork and cornmeal mush, eaten from a communal pot with wooden spoons. Fresh vegetables appeared in summer and early fall and were preserved, with varying success, in root cellars. Meat was a salted or smoked thing, kept in barrels carefully rationed. Fresh fruit was seasonal and gone too quickly. The monotony of this diet wasn't merely unpleasant. It had physical consequences. Dental problems were common. Vitamin deficiencies were widespread. A population living on salt pork and cornmeal was slowly accruing a debt that showed up in shortened lifespans and bodies worn down far too young. This is part of what the gold rush was promising to change. Not just the abstract promise of wealth, but the very specific things that wealth makes possible. More and better food, more varied shelter, more ability to choose how you spend your days. The 49ers weren't chasing luxury. They were chasing adequacy. The possibility of vegetables in winter, a house warm enough to sleep in without 3 layers of clothing, a future for their children that wasn't already decided by the depletion of the land beneath their feet. That's not a romantic dream. That's a very ordinary human want. An understanding that it was want, not romance, that fill those wagon trains, that changes everything about how you stand in relation to this story. Here's what most people believe about the California Gold Rush. They believe it was a story of American optimism, of rugged, sun-bronzed individuals swirling pans in a California river and pulling up nuggets the size of their fists. They believe the 49ers were a special breed, adventurous, unafraid, constitutionally incapable of settling for the ordinary life that lesser men accepted. They believed the gold rush was, at its core, a story of freedom. The freedom to go west, to start over, to become whoever you decided to be in a place where nobody knew your name, or your failures, or your father's failures before you. This is the version that shows up in paintings, in textbooks, in the kind of cheerful summaries that compress 5 years of messy human experience into 2 paragraphs of national legend. And it isn't entirely wrong. There were men who went west purely for the thrill of it, who felt something catch fire inside them at the idea of an open road and an unknown horizon. Adventure is a real human motive, and it was absolutely present in the gold rush. But the truth, the full, uncomfortable, historically accurate truth, is that for most of its participants, the gold rush wasn't primarily a story of freedom and optimism. It was a story of desperation. And the difference between those two things changes everything about who went, why they went, and what actually happened when they got there. Most people believe James Marshall's discovery at Sutter's Mill simply offered Americans an opportunity. The truth is that it offered them an escape. Consider the timing. The late 1840s in America were a period of profound economic instability for working people. The Panic of 1837 had sent shockwaves through the economy that were still being felt a full decade later. In tightened credit, in collapsed land values, in the specific vulnerability of farming families who'd borrowed against future harvests, the market no longer supported. Agricultural prices had been in a long, slow decline that squeezed farm families mercilessly across the Midwest and border states. The industrialization of the textile mills in New England had created a class of workers who were, for the first time in American history, entirely dependent on wages they didn't set and couldn't negotiate. That was a fundamentally new and deeply unsettling condition for people raised in a culture of self-sufficiency and land ownership, and the waves of immigration in the 1840s, particularly from Ireland and Germany, had flooded certain labour markets, pushing wages down further and turning already difficult situations into something genuinely precarious. The gold rush didn't arrive in a prosperous country offering its citizens another avenue to wealth. It arrived in a struggling country offering its most desperate people the only realistic exit they could see. The numbers bear this out in ways that rarely make it into the popular telling. Historians studying the migration patterns of the 49ers have found that the regions producing the highest concentrations of westward travellers were consistently the regions under the greatest economic strain. Western Virginia, where soil exhaustion was already a serious problem. The textile belt of New England, where mill wages had been stagnant or falling. The port cities of the East Coast, where newly arrived immigrants faced poverty so acute it was genuinely life-threatening. People didn't leave comfortable lives for the gold rush. They left broken ones, and here is the deeper, more unsettling truth buried beneath even that. The vast majority of people who went to California never struck it rich. They never found significant gold. The mythology of the gold rush is built around the exceptions, the spectacular finds, the men who pulled thousands of dollars worth of gold from the ground in a single afternoon. But the average 49er working a placer claim in the Sierra Nevada foothills earned somewhere between $3 and $6 a day in the peak years, roughly comparable to, or only marginally better than, what a skilled craftsman could earn back east. And from that, they had to pay for food, tools, shelter and supplies in a market where inflation had gone completely out of control. California had almost no infrastructure. Everything had to be shipped in from the outside world. A pound of flour that cost 4 cents in Missouri cost 75 cents in the camps. A single egg, when eggs were available at all, could cost $1. A blanket went for $40 or $50. A decent pair of boots might run $100. The gold a miner pulled from the ground was being systematically transferred back out of his pockets by the merchants selling him the means to survive. Think about that for a moment, because that detail reframes everything the gold rush is supposed to stand for. By 1851 and 1852, the easy surface gold was already largely played out. The individual miner with a pan and a strong back was being replaced by industrial hydraulic operations requiring heavy capital investment, the kind of money individual 49ers never had. The real money in the California gold rush flowed not primarily to the miners, but to the men who sold them things, the merchants, the suppliers, the boarding house operators, the saloon keepers. Samuel Brannan, often called the first millionaire of the gold rush, made his fortune not from mining, but from buying up every mining tool he could find and reselling them at enormous markup the moment gold was announced. He cleared an estimated $150,000 in a matter of months. The miners he sold to were lucky to clear a fraction of that in a lifetime of hard labour. Levi Strauss came to California to sell dry goods. He didn't make his fortune from gold. He made it from the durable canvas pants he began producing for the men who were searching for it. So when we say the gold rush was a story of American dreams, that's partially true. But whose dreams, and at what cost? Because the 60, 70, 80% of 49ers who came home no richer than they left, often poorer, often worn down by disease and hardship, those people's stories don't get painted on the canvas of national memory. They just go quiet. The men and women who went anyway, who sold everything they had for a chance the odds were strongly against, weren't naive. They were people who had calculated, correctly or not, that the odds in California, however long, were better than the odds in the life they were already living. That's not optimism in any romantic sense. That is a very specific, very rational form of desperation, and understanding that raises an uncomfortable question. If these people weren't primarily driven by dreams of adventure, but by the collapse of the life they already had, what does it mean to celebrate their story as a triumph of the American spirit, while refusing to honestly reckon with the conditions that made them desperate enough to take the chance? The myth of the carefree 49er has one more layer worth peeling back. Debt. A significant number of the men and women who headed to California in 1849 and 1850 went specifically because they were in debt. Farm mortgages taken out against future harvests that never came. Credit extended by merchants in the boom years of the early 1840s, soured by the end of the decade. Store accounts that had compounded in ways the original borrowers hadn't fully understood when they signed the paper. Debt in this era wasn't a bureaucratic abstraction. It was a physical, social, and sometimes legal condition. Debtors could be sued in the courts of their home states. Their property could be seized. And in a small community, the public humiliation of a debt judgment, announced in the local newspaper, discussed at church, could be as damaging as the financial loss itself. Running from debt was a real and specific motivation for a significant portion of the gold rush migration, and California offered a particular kind of relief that no other destination could. The legal and practical inability of Eastern creditors to follow you across 2,000 miles of unsettled continent. Many of the 49ers who left in 1849 were, in the blunt language of the time, fleeing their obligations. They chose California specifically because California was far enough away that those obligations couldn't reach them. This wasn't the version of the story anyone was advertising. It didn't appear in the newspaper accounts of the migration, but it was real, and it was common, and it explains a particular quality of the gold rush that other framings can't quite account for. The finality of it, the completeness of the break, the specific refusal to look back. When you're leaving debt behind, you don't look back. Looking back is how creditors find you. Her name was Lucina Stanley Wilson, and she was, by almost any measure, a practical woman. She hadn't been raised to be romantic about her circumstances. Born in 1819 in North Carolina, and raised across various places as her family moved with the rhythms of early American life. Lucina had grown up understanding that survival wasn't a passive condition. It was something you actively built, day by day, decision by decision, with the materials available to you at that particular moment. She'd married Mason Wilson in the late 1840s, and they'd settled in Missouri, a state caught between two worlds, part South, part frontier, uncertain about its own identity in an uncertain era. By 1849, the farm was not doing well. That sounds simple and clinical when you read it on a page, but for the people living it, it had the quality of a slow-moving catastrophe. The soil wasn't producing what it had in earlier years. The money they'd hoped to put aside wasn't materializing. The two young boys needed feeding, clothing, educating, and the distance between what the farm was giving and what the family needed wasn't narrowing. It was growing, season by season, with the patient, relentless quality of a problem that hasn't been solved. Luzina would later write about this period with the unsentimental clarity of a woman who'd been forced to see her life very clearly, because softening the view was a luxury she couldn't afford. She remembered the quality of the light in those Missouri mornings, thin and cold in winter, heavy and suffocating in summer. She remembered the way the farm consumed everything without giving enough back. And she remembered the conversations she and Mason had in low voices after the boys were asleep, about what to do, about whether staying made sense, about whether the talk coming through the territory about gold in California was the kind of thing a sensible person paid attention to. That talk had been growing louder since late 1848. President Polk had confirmed the discovery in his December address to Congress. Newspapers were printing accounts that seemed almost impossible. Men pulling hundreds of dollars worth of gold from California riverbeds in a single afternoon. In that Missouri farmhouse, those reports had a very specific quality. Too good to be true, but too detailed to entirely dismiss. And then, in the spring of 1849, Mason Wilson said, "Let's go." What happened next revealed something essential about who Luzina was and about the nature of this migration more broadly. She didn't greet the plan with enthusiasm. She was terrified. She knew even then that the overland crossing to California wasn't an adventure. It was an ordeal. She'd heard about the trail, 2,000 miles of some of the most demanding terrain on the continent. People died on it. It required leaving behind almost everything they owned, because the wagon could only carry so much and the oxen had to be able to pull it across mountains and desert. She looked at her two small boys, their faces, their hands, the particular way each of them moved, and she made a calculation, not a romantic one, a practical one. The odds of a meaningful future in Missouri, the way things were going, versus the odds of finding something better in California. The calculation didn't resolve cleanly in California's favor. It resolved against Missouri's. In April of 1849, the Wilson family loaded a wagon. Luzina packed what she could fit. She left behind furniture, dishes, things she had spent years accumulating, the material record of a domestic life built up, object by object, through careful management. She took food, clothing, basic tools, and the family's most essential documents. She took her children, and she walked out of that Missouri farmhouse into a spring morning that smelled of mud and new grass, carrying possibility and dread in proportions she couldn't have told you. She didn't look back. She said so later. Not because she wasn't sad. She was devastated, in the particular way you're devastated by a choice you know you had to make. But she understood, with the pragmatic clarity that would define her for the rest of her life, that looking back wouldn't change anything. The wagon was pointing west. That was where her family was going. The trail in 1849 was not just difficult, it was catastrophic. Cholera had broken out along the Missouri River departure points earlier that year, and by the time the Wilson party was on the Platte River Road heading west, they were passing graves with disturbing regularity. Graves so freshly dug the earth hadn't settled yet. Graves marked with wooden boards, sometimes just a pile of rocks. Graves of children. The Platte River Valley is a landscape of almost surreal flatness. Open grasslands stretching to every horizon, the river wide and shallow and full of quicksand bars. The wind comes across that plain without anything to slow it down, and in spring it can be cold enough to numb your hands even as the calendar says May. At night the temperature drops sharply, and the sounds of the prairie fill a darkness so complete You can lose yourself in it if you're not careful. The children slept in the wagon on the worst nights. Luzina slept sitting up, a practice she'd describe later as something between rest and vigil. She watched a man bury his wife 40 miles outside of Fort Kearny, then continue west because he had no choice. Turning back meant facing the same failure that had pushed him out the door in the first place. She watched a woman walking alongside her wagon because the load was too heavy for the oxen to pull with passengers, walking through sand and sage in shoes that weren't built for 20 miles a day. She felt the particular exhaustion that sets in after weeks of this. Not the clean tiredness of a hard day's work, but a deep cellular depletion that sits in your bones and doesn't leave no matter how long you sleep. But she also noticed something she'd write about later with a kind of quiet wonder, the generosity that appeared on the trail, spontaneously. Between strangers who had no reason to help each other except that help was the only thing standing between any of them and catastrophe. People shared food when they had it. They helped with broken wagon wheels. They sat with the sick, even when sitting with the sick could mean contracting the same illness. What's remarkable is that this kind of selflessness didn't emerge despite the desperation of the trail. It emerged because of it. Luzina Stanley Wilson crossed the Sierra Nevada in late summer of 1849 and arrived in California. She was thin. She was tired in a way she hadn't thought possible before the crossing. Her children were alive, which felt by that point like a small miracle that required daily acknowledgement. Her husband was alive. They had made it. She had no idea what was waiting for her. None of them did. And yet, standing at the base of those mountains, looking out at California for the first time, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Years later, she tried to describe it as the feeling of having survived something so difficult that survival itself became a kind of proof that she was capable of things she hadn't known before. The woman who had walked out of that Missouri farmhouse in April was not the same woman standing in California in September, even though she occupied the same body and answered to the same name. The gold rush didn't just move people across a continent, it transformed them on the way. Whether what waited on the other side was worth the transformation, that was a question each of them had to answer for themselves. The physical experience of crossing the Rockies in Sierra Nevada, the actual bodily experience of mountain travel in 1849 without modern equipment, without accurate maps, without reliable weather information, was something no amount of newspaper reading had prepared anyone for. The mountains weren't merely large. They were large in a way that had no precedent in the experience of people who'd never travelled farther west than the Alleghenies, and the Alleghenies were foothills by comparison. The air at elevation was thin in ways that confused and frightened people who'd never experienced altitude sickness. They described it as feeling drunk, or feeling as though something was wrong with their lungs that they couldn't name. Oxen struggled at high elevation and had to be coaxed, rested, and sometimes abandoned when they couldn't go on. Wagons had to be disassembled and hauled up the steepest pitches by rope and human muscle, then put back together on the other side. Water sources grew scarce and unpredictable. The temperature swings between day and night at altitude were severe enough to crack wagon wood and freeze water supplies overnight. None of this was in the newspapers. None of it appeared in the promotional materials distributed by outfitting merchants in St. Joseph and Independence. It was known, in a general way, by mountain men and early settlers who'd been over the trail before. But that knowledge wasn't widely passed along to the hundreds of thousands of people deciding to attempt the crossing. The gap between the information available to the migrants and the information they actually needed was, looking back, one of the defining features of the gold rush and one of its primary sources of suffering. Before we follow the 49ers into the gold fields, we need to stop. We need to turn around. and look at who was already there. The California that James Marshall's discovery threw open to the world was not, in any honest sense, an empty place. It was home to somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 native people, members of dozens of distinct nations and language groups who had lived in those river valleys, foothill forests and coastal ranges for thousands of years. The Miwok and Maidu in the Sierra Nevada foothills, the Yokuts in the Central Valley, the Ohlone along the coast, the Pomo, the Wintun, the Shasta. Peoples with complex social structures, sophisticated food systems, and deep spiritual traditions tied to specific landscapes, with no particular interest in being disrupted by the largest mass migration their territory had ever seen. The history of what happened to these people during and after the gold rush is one of the most devastating chapters in American history, and it's very rarely told as part of the gold rush story itself. It tends to get filed away in a separate chapter, labelled Native American History, treated as a distinct subject, which conveniently allows the celebration of the 49ers to continue without the weight of what that celebration is sitting on top of. So let's put it back together, because it belongs together. When gold seekers began flooding into the Sierra Nevada foothills in 1848 and 1849, they entered land that native communities had managed, harvested, and lived within for thousands of years. The oak woodlands covering those hills produced acorns that were a critical food source for many California peoples. The rivers weren't just geological features. They were fisheries, water sources, ceremonial spaces, the physical expression of a relationship between communities and the world they inhabited. The entire landscape was not wilderness to the people living in it. It was home. It was in many ways a kind of library, encoded with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to live in this specific place. The 49ers didn't see it that way. In the framework of the time, they saw land that was unoccupied, which in 19th century American legal and cultural thinking meant land that hadn't been developed in ways recognizable to European eyes. No fence posts, no ploughed, furrows, no town square, therefore available. What followed was systematic dispossession carried out through a combination of deliberate violence, legal manipulation, and biological catastrophe. California's first American governor, Peter Burnett, delivered a message to the state legislature in 1851 in which he stated plainly that a war of extermination against California's native populations would continue until they were extinct. Because in his view, extinction was the inevitable outcome of contact between civilization and savagery. This was not a fringe position, it was mainstream, stated openly by an elected official of a state that had been in the Union for less than a year. California's native population had already been severely damaged by the Spanish mission system. Contact with the arriving migrants accelerated that damage to a rate that modern historians classify as genocidal. Before the gold rush, California's native population was estimated at around 100,000 people. By 1870, that number had fallen to approximately 30,000, a collapse of 70% in roughly 2 decades. Disease played a role, as it always did, in contact between indigenous peoples and settlers, but so did starvation caused by the destruction of food systems, displacement from traditional lands, and direct organized violence carried out by settler militias that the California state government actively funded and reimbursed. The state of California spent approximately $1.7 million between 1850 and 1859 paying militia companies for military expeditions against native people. This wasn't a side effect of the gold rush. It was a policy the gold rush made politically possible to carry out. And now here is the perspective shift, the one that reframes everything that's come before it in this story. Every single narrative of gold rush triumph sits on top of this reality. every 49er who struck it rich, every entrepreneur who built a fortune supplying the camps, every town that grew into a city, all of it was built on land taken from people who had no say in the taking and no recourse once it was done. This doesn't diminish the very real hardship and courage of the people who came west. The Missouri farm wife who walked 2,000 miles, the Irish immigrant who survived cholera on the Platte River, the Chinese labourer who endured violent racism in the mining camps. Their stories are genuine, their suffering was real, but they are not the only story. And the tendency to tell the gold rush as purely a story of human triumph requires the sustained erasure of 100,000 people who were in California before any of them arrived. There's another dimension that rarely gets considered. Several Miwok communities had for generations known about the presence of gold in their rivers. They hadn't built an economy around it, because in their understanding of the world, gold wasn't a store of value, it was part of the earth. The way river stones and oak trees were part of the earth. You didn't hoard part of the earth, you lived within it. Most people don't realize that the knowledge the 49ers treated as a revelation had been carried by California's indigenous peoples for generations, without anyone considering it a reason to tear the world apart. That contrast sits quietly at the center of the gold rush story, and what it suggests about different ways of understanding the value of the world is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Zena Stanley Wilson and everyone like her arrived into this torn and complicated place. A California that was already a scene of collision, displacement and transformation on a scale that most of the arriving migrants couldn't clearly see, because they were too close to it and too focused on their own survival to see beyond it. The dream she carried across the mountains was real, and the cost of that dream, paid by people who didn't choose to pay it and had no voice in whether it was asked of them, was also real. Both of those things are true at the same time, and understanding that is the beginning of understanding the gold rush honestly, rather than mythologically. The legal and diplomatic situation in California when the 49ers arrived was nearly as chaotic as the physical one. The territory had been acquired from Mexico less than a year before the peak of the migration, and the American government hadn't yet established effective civil authority over it. No clearly established law applied, no working courts operated, no consistent mechanism existed for resolving disputes over land, property, or violence. The mining camps filled that vacuum with improvised institutions, miners' courts that operated by consensus, claim rules established by local agreement rather than statute, dispute resolution that ranged from reasonably fair to summary and violent depending on the community and the circumstances. These improvised systems weren't nothing. They represented genuine human creativity in the face of complete institutional absence. Some of them worked. Some of them were instruments of the majority's power over ethnic and racial minorities, operating under the form of law while quietly dispensing its opposite. The foreign miners' tax passed by the California legislature in 1850 imposed a $20 monthly fee on all non-American miners. For most foreign workers, that was more than they could earn in a month of digging. The effect, which its supporters clearly intended, was to drive non-American miners off their claims and out of the goldfields entirely. Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese workers pushed aside to make room for American-born miners. The tax was eventually repealed after protests and enforcement difficulties, then reinstated in a revised form targeting Chinese miners specifically. It was, in effect, state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing of the mining economy, accomplished through financial policy rather than military force. The dream was real, and so was the machinery built to protect it for some at the direct expense of others. That tension between the promise and the price runs through everything that follows. The smell of a California mining camp in 1849 was something no newspaper back east had prepared anyone for. It hit you before you even saw the camp itself. A dense, complicated wave of unwashed bodies and wood smoke and wet wool and horse manure, and something darker underneath. Something organic and decomposing that you eventually identified as the camp's makeshift latrines, dug too close to the creek beds, doing almost nothing to contain what they were meant to contain. The smell of a place where 10,000 men had arrived faster than any sanitation system could possibly follow, where the basic structures of ordinary life, clean water, food supply, medical care, shelter, had been completely overwhelmed by a migration that nobody had planned for and nobody was managing. The physical reality of the California goldfields in 1849 was one of the great dissonances of American history. In the newspapers of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, the stories were unambiguous. Men were pulling gold from California riverbeds like picking wildflowers from a meadow. President James Polk had confirmed the discovery in his December 1848 address to Congress, displaying a tea caddy containing 230 ounces of California gold and effectively giving the migration his presidential seal of approval. The illustrations in the papers showed sunny riverside scenes, smiling men, gleaming nuggets. It looked like a harvest festival in paradise. The reality was a construction site at the edge of human endurance. Tent cities had gone up overnight along the tributaries of the American River, the Feather, the Yuba, the Bear, the Stanislaus, and they had the quality of places built by people who didn't know how long they were staying. Canvas tents, poorly pitched, collapsed in the frequent rains. Lean-to structures cut from whatever timber could be taken quickly sagged under their own weight. The streets, such as they were, turned into rivers of mud every time it rained, and in the Sierra Nevada foothills in winter, it rained often and heavily. Men who had walked 2,000 miles to get here found themselves living in conditions that were, by any honest measure, significantly worse than the poverty they had left behind. The prices were the first real shock. A mining camp in 1849 was an economy with almost no supply and overwhelming demand, and the results were as brutal as basic economics predicts. A pound of flour that cost 4 cents in Missouri cost 75 cents in the camps. A single egg, when eggs were available at all, could cost $1. A blanket essential against the cold Sierra nights went for $40, $50, $60. A pair of decent boots might run $100. Everything had to be shipped by sea around Cape Horn or hauled over the mountains by mule team, and the effect on the individual miner was economically devastating. The gold he was pulling from the ground was being systematically transferred back out of his pockets by the merchants selling him the means to survive. A miner needed to clear at least $6 to $8 a day just to break even with camp expenses. In the peak months of 1848 and early 1849, some surface claims produced that and more. But the best placer deposits, the shallow accumulations of gold in river bends and gravel bars near the surface, were being worked at a rate that depleted them visibly from one month to the next. Each new wave of arrivals found the landscape a little more picked over than the wave before them. The men arriving in 1850 weren't arriving to the same California the first miners of 1848 had found. They were arriving to a place where the easiest gold was already gone. What remained required harder work, more sophisticated technique, and increasingly large amounts of capital to extract efficiently. The individual 49er, the free agent with a gold pan and a pick and an independent claim, was becoming obsolete almost at the moment he arrived. The structure of the gold rush had shifted beneath him before he had time to plant his feet. The physical dangers were something else the newspapers hadn't covered. Mining was dangerous in ways that were only partially understood at the time. Men drowned in river diversions gone wrong, tunnels collapsed, scurvy, caused by months of living on salt pork, beans and hardtack with almost no fresh produce, became epidemic in the camps. Miners sometimes didn't recognize the symptoms as a nutritional problem. It had the quality of something mysterious rather than something preventable. The Sierra Nevada mountains, beautiful and indifferent, killed men through exposure and avalanche in winter. Malaria spread through the river valleys. Dysentery moved through the camps with depressing regularity, carried by water contaminated by every upstream mining operation fouling the supply for everyone downstream. The mortality rate in the California goldfields in the early 1850s is difficult to calculate precisely because record keeping was almost non-existent. But historians estimate that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the 49ers who made it to California died within their first few years there, not primarily from violence, from disease and accident, and the consequences of living at the absolute edge of what the human body can sustain. These numbers never made the newspapers. The man who died of scurvy in a Sacramento boarding house didn't generate the kind of story that sold papers back east. And so the letters home were filtered through a powerful psychological mechanism. The impossibility of admitting catastrophic failure to people who had watched you leave with hope. Men wrote about their prospects, their plans, the possibility of a strike just around the corner. They downplayed or left out entirely the reality of what they were actually living day to day. Because admitting the truth meant admitting they might have made a terrible mistake, and they had left too much behind, financially, emotionally, in every way that mattered, to allow that thought to fully form. The tension in those camps wasn't just physical, it was deeply, corrosively psychological. A man who had sold his Ohio farm for $400, spent $300 getting to California, and was now barely covering his expenses, faced a peculiar and devastating kind of trap. He couldn't go back. Going back meant walking into the faces of everyone who had watched him leave, and he couldn't fully let himself believe the situation was as bad as it was, because that would require a reckoning he wasn't ready for. So he stayed. He kept mining. He kept writing optimistic letters home, and the gap between what he was writing and what he was actually living kept growing. The dream was still alive. It was just running out of time. And somewhere in all of this, in the mud and the smoke and the extortionate egg prices and the letters piling up at the post office in Sacramento, a woman named Lucina Stanley Wilson arrived, with 2 children, a husband, and no gold pan. What she did next says more about the real gold rush than almost anything else. By 1852, 1853, and 1854, a growing stream of 49ers were quietly making the decision to stop mining and do something else, or to leave California entirely. The pattern of their departures tells us something important about how the gold rush actually settled out as an economic event for its participants. The men who left California with money, not necessarily fortunes, but enough to start something back home, were overwhelmingly the ones who had found a different economic foothold rather than continuing to mine. The merchants, the freighters, the skilled tradespeople, the professional men. California's economy by the early 1850s was growing rapidly, and it needed the full range of skills that any functioning society requires. The carpenter who had come to mine and ended up building houses for the miners was, by 1853, often doing considerably better than the men he was building for. The men who left with nothing, or less than nothing, were often the most stubbornly committed to the original plan, the ones who had come to mine gold and couldn't let go of that identity, even as the economics of individual placer mining became increasingly impossible. Their commitment to the original vision had become a trap. The man who couldn't adapt from miner to merchant, from gold seeker to something else, was the man most likely to end up walking back to Missouri with empty pockets and a story he didn't know how to tell. This pattern, the adaptable surviving, the rigidly committed failing, shows up in crisis after crisis throughout American economic history. The gold rush is simply one of its earliest and most dramatic examples, documented in unusual detail because so many of the people living it left written records behind. There is a detail about James Marshall's gold discovery that almost nobody knows, and it changes the entire story of how the gold rush became the gold rush. When Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill on January 24th, 1848, his first instinct, and the instinct of his employer John Sutter, was to keep it quiet. Sutter understood immediately that a gold rush would be catastrophic for everything he'd built. He had constructed a remarkable agricultural empire in California's Sacramento Valley, a flour mill, a tannery, a blanket factory, orchards, and some of the most productive farmland on the Pacific coast. A gold rush would flood his land with strangers, strip away his workforce, destroy his crops, and unravel everything he had spent years carefully assembling. His prediction was completely correct in every particular. Within a year of the discovery, Sutter's workers had abandoned him for the goldfields. Squatters had overrun his land, asserting mining claims that the legal chaos of the early rush made almost impossible to contest. His mills had been dismantled and repurposed, his cattle slaughtered by hungry miners who didn't particularly care whose property they were on. The man on whose land the gold rush was born ended up bankrupt, his empire erased. A cautionary tale about the gap between what you build and what survives when the world starts moving faster than any single person can track. But here is the hidden layer the textbooks consistently leave out. The gold rush didn't become the gold rush because of the gold itself. It became the gold rush because of the newspapers, specifically because of one newspaper run by one man who had a very particular financial interest in spreading the news as loudly and as irresistibly as possible. His name was Samuel Brannan, a Mormon elder, a businessman, and the publisher of the California Star, San Francisco's leading newspaper at the time. When word of Marshall's discovery reached the city, Brannan didn't rush to print the story. He did something considerably more calculated. For several weeks, he quietly bought up every pickaxe, shovel, gold pan, and piece of mining equipment he could find, purchasing them at ordinary prices from merchants who hadn't yet understood what was coming. He stockpiled these supplies at his store near the goldfields, systematically, silently, without explaining his intentions to anyone. Then, on May 12th, 1848, Samuel Brannan walked through the streets of San Francisco, carrying a bottle of gold dust, shouting the words that would change the country. Gold. Gold from the American River. He printed the story in his paper. He sent copies east. He made sure the news reached every corner of the country and beyond. Within weeks, San Francisco was nearly deserted. Men with ordinary lives and steady incomes dropped everything and rushed toward the mountains, passing through Brannan's store on the way, buying his shovels and pans at prices marked up by several 100%. In a matter of months, Brannan had made an estimated $150,000, not from mining a single ounce of gold himself, but from creating a gold rush and positioning himself at the center of it before anyone else knew what was happening. He wasn't, by the standards of his time, a villain. He was a businessman operating within entirely legal norms, with no obligation to be transparent about his motives. But the lesson his story carries has echoed across the century and a half since. The people who profited most from the gold rush were rarely the ones doing the mining. Brannan was just the most colourful example of a much broader pattern. The eastern newspapers driving the migration were largely operated by men with strong commercial interest in high circulation. Dramatic stories about California gold sold papers. More readers meant more advertising revenue. The incentive to publish the most sensational accounts of gold rush success was enormous, and the editorial standards of the time didn't include anything resembling modern verification practices. Accounts of miners pulling $1,500 from a single afternoon's work were printed with the same confidence as carefully checked stories. Nobody was lying exactly, but nobody was being careful about the truth either. The shipping companies transporting 49ers around Cape Horn or across the Isthmus of Panama had obvious interests in encouraging the migration. Passage rates on the California route jumped from $100 to $600 almost overnight, and the ships were still packed beyond their designed capacity. The merchants who outfitted wagon trains departing from St. Joseph and Independence had every reason to want as many wagons as possible rolling out each spring. The storekeepers setting up shop in the mining towns needed as many men as possible, arriving to buy what they were selling. The entire economic system surrounding the gold rush was structured so that the people who most needed honest information about California were the people least likely to receive it. The desperate Ohio farmer, the exhausted mill worker, the struggling immigrant family. Every layer of information they received had been filtered through commercial interest, each one shaped by the financial incentive to keep the migration going and growing. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was something more ordinary than that, and in some ways more troubling. It was a market for hope, in which the sellers had enormous financial power and the buyers had enormous emotional need. And the normal corrective mechanism of honest accounting was systematically absent. The federal government had its own role to play. California had been acquired through the Mexican-American War, which ended in February 1848, just weeks after Marshall's discovery. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred California and the Southwest to the United States in exchange for $15 million. The Mexican government signed away the richest gold deposit in North American history without knowing it existed. When President Polk confirmed the discovery in December 1848, he did so in a context the government understood clearly: a militarily acquired territory that needed rapid civilian settlement to consolidate American control. More settlers in California meant more political pressure for statehood. The gold rush served geopolitical goals that nobody stated openly, but that shaped the federal response to it at every level. All of this, the commercial promotion, the newspaper sensationalism, the shipping industry profits, the geopolitical calculation, formed the hidden machinery underneath a migration that most participants experienced as a purely personal, purely desperate choice. They believed they were acting on their own judgment, and they were. But that judgment had been shaped by forces they couldn't see, and wouldn't have had the language to fully describe. The desperate Ohio farmer loading his wagon wasn't wrong to want a better life. He just didn't know how many people were making money off his wanting. The racial geography of the California goldfields deserves more careful attention than it usually receives, because it reveals something fundamental about how the American promise has always operated in practice, versus how it reads on paper. The early California mining economy was multiracial in ways that had almost no parallel anywhere else in the United States at that time. Chilean miners who had worked placer deposits in the Andes arrived early and were among the most skilled operators in the fields. Mexican miners from Sonora brought techniques for separating gold from ore that were considerably more refined than what most American-born workers were using. Chinese miners, who began arriving in significant numbers after 1849, brought extraordinary patience and a willingness to work claims that others had already walked away from, and often found meaningful gold through more thorough processing. The response to this multiracial competence wasn't admiration. It was systematic exclusion. The foreign miners' tax, the violence in the camps that went without legal consequence, the gradual legal structures restricting land ownership and mining claims to American citizens. All of it was designed to concentrate the economic benefits of the gold rush in American-born hands, specifically white American-born hands. The skill and labour of non-white participants was tolerated when it was needed, and eliminated when it became competitive. This wasn't incidental to the gold rush story. It was central to its economic logic. The Chinese miners who were driven from their claims by taxation and by violence often moved to the least desirable locations, the ground everyone else had already worked and abandoned, and there, through more patient and thorough methods, they frequently found gold that the earlier miners had missed. Their persistence in the face of deliberate exclusion is one of the least told stories of the gold rush, and one of the most quietly remarkable. The morning after Lucina Stanley Wilson arrived in the California mining settlement of Nevada City, she made breakfast. That sounds unremarkable until you understand what it meant. She was exhausted in a way she didn't yet have words for, depleted by months of walking and wagon riding and watching the trail take its toll on everyone around her. Her children were thin and pale, their faces carrying the specific hollowness that comes from weeks of not eating enough. Her husband was already making plans to head to the goldfields, which meant Lucina was, in practical terms, on her own, in a place she didn't know, with no home, no income, no established connections, and no clear path forward that she could see. But she had flour, she had lard and salt and a cast-iron skillet that had survived the entire crossing, secured under the wagon seat and carried across 2 mountain ranges, and she cooked. A miner she'd never met smelled the biscuits from 50 yards away and walked over. He was a large man, sunburned to the colour of old leather, heavily bearded, wearing clothes that hadn't been washed since Missouri. He looked, she recalled later, like a man who hadn't eaten anything that wasn't hardtack or beans in months, which was almost certainly exactly what he was. She sold him a biscuit. He paid her, and then looked at her with an expression she described as a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment, as though he'd forgotten that food could taste like something made by a human being, rather than assembled from bare survival ingredients. She sold biscuits to 10 more miners that morning. By afternoon, she had made the decision that would define the rest of her California life. She was going to feed people, not as a domestic task, not as wifely duty performed in exchange for nothing, but as a business, deliberate, organised, commercially structured, and run entirely by her. She had seen something the goldfields had in overwhelming supply: men who were hungry, men who were earning some amount of money, men who were completely incapable of cooking anything edible for themselves. And she had exactly what they needed. She could cook. She could cook well, and fast, and in quantity. And she could do it consistently in conditions that would have stopped most people before they started. Within days of her arrival, Lucina had negotiated the use of a rough plank table and set up what she called a hotel. In its earliest form, it was a cook tent where men could pay for a meal, and sometimes for a canvas-covered space to sleep. She charged $1 per meal. In an economy where a single egg cost the same, the miners paid without complaint. They paid partly for the food, and partly, Lucina understood with a clarity she'd articulate years later, because a woman cooking a real meal in a rough mining camp represented something they hadn't had in months. A semblance of ordinary life, warmth, the feeling, however brief, that the world they had left behind hadn't entirely evaporated. She wasn't the only woman in the camps doing this, though she was one of very few. In 1849 and 1850, men outnumbered women in the California mining regions by ratios ranging from 10 to 1 to 50 to 1, depending on where you were. But the women who were there, particularly those with domestic skills and the nerve to treat those skills as a business rather than a duty, occupied an economic position that was, by the standards of the time, extraordinary. The scarcity of women's labour created a market for it that elevated its value far beyond anything it commanded back east. A woman who could wash clothes charged $8 per dozen items, at a time when the same work back home might earn 50 cents. A woman who could cook a decent meal in a gold camp was earning per day what many of her counterparts in New England mills earned in a week. The gold rush didn't create gender equality, not by any stretch, but it created in those California camps a strange and temporary inversion of the usual rules. The scarcity of traditionally female labour gave the women who were present an economic leverage they had never previously held, and wouldn't hold again in quite this way once California settled into more conventional patterns. Lucina used that leverage with intelligence and discipline. She reinvested her early earnings into expanding the operation. She hired a Mexican man to help with the heavier work, and a Chinese man who turned out, she wrote with evident admiration, to be a considerably better baker than she was. She expanded from biscuits to full meals, from meals to boarding. She tracked her income carefully, banked what she could, and paid her debts promptly. A habit she credited later with keeping her solvent in an environment where credit could spiral into catastrophe with terrifying speed if you let it. She also lost everything, twice. California in the 1850s wasn't a stable place to build anything. Lucina's enterprises were destroyed once by flood and once by fire. The twin catastrophes that periodically swept through the hastily constructed mining towns and erased months of accumulated work in a single afternoon. The camps were built almost entirely of wood, tightly packed and chronically dry, and they burned with a speed that left almost no time to save anything. The rivers, swollen and rerouted by the hydraulic operations rearranging the landscape upstream, flooded with a violence that nothing in Missouri had prepared her for. Each time she rebuilt. Each time from a position of having essentially nothing, no inventory, no equipment, no building, she looked at what she still had, identified a need she could meet with those materials, and started again. That's what survival under real pressure actually looks like. Not heroic in the cinematic sense, iterative, unglamorous, often frightening. It's standing in the mud where your business used to be and figuring out, one more time from the beginning, what you can still do with what you have left. The men in the goldfields were doing the same thing in their own way. The ones who came through intact, not necessarily with money, but with themselves still whole, were the ones who adapted fastest to the California they'd actually found, rather than continuing to fight for the one they'd arrived expecting. Men who came as miners became merchants. Men who came for gold discovered that their skills as carpenters, blacksmiths, doctors, or lawyers were worth more in California's rapidly growing economy than anything they might have pulled from the ground. The gold rush, for all its brutality, was also an extraordinary laboratory of human adaptability. It took people hemmed in by the rigid social structures of the East, structures that said your father's trade was your trade, that your birth determined your ceiling, and dropped them into an environment where none of that applied, where what you could do mattered more than who your family was, where a woman who could make biscuits and had the nerve to sell them could, over the course of a few years, become a businesswoman of genuine substance and independence. The dream survived, even when the goal didn't pan out. It survived by being resourceful enough to become something else. And what did the 49ers bring back to the places they had left? The ones who returned, and a significant number did, either because California hadn't delivered what they'd come for, or because home pulled them back in ways they hadn't expected. They brought back something more complicated than gold or failure. They brought back changed minds. The social historian Gunther Peck, writing about Western migration in the 19th century, described what he called the democratizing effect of shared hardship on populations from rigidly stratified backgrounds. The trail and the mining camps had a way of stripping away the visible markers of class that Eastern society used to maintain its hierarchies. In the goldfields, the Harvard-educated lawyer and the illiterate farmer wore the same muddy boots, ate from the same communal pot, and worked the same gravel. This shared condition didn't erase all distinctions. It created new ones, based on the specific skills the new environment valued. But it disrupted the old ones in ways the returnees carried home with them. A man who had spent 2 years treating a Harvard-educated lawyer as an equal. Because in the goldfields, they genuinely were equals in the ways that mattered. That man came back to Ohio or Virginia or New York with a different understanding of what social hierarchy actually was, whether it was natural or simply constructed. He came back with a different relationship to his own place in the world. He came back, often, with a quiet resistance to automatic assumptions of superiority that he had seen disproven in California, and a willingness to say so that he might not have had before the trail. This is one of the less discussed legacies of the gold rush. It produced in a significant number of the men who lived through it a kind of democratic social awareness that they carried back into the communities they returned to. It didn't make them egalitarians in the modern sense, but it made them skeptical of certain kinds of social authority in ways that left lasting marks on American political life in the 1850s and well beyond. Every generation thinks its migration story is unprecedented. In 2023, more than 2.5 million people were encountered at the United States southern border, the highest number ever recorded by US Customs and Border Protection. The news coverage was enormous. The political debate was fierce, and the human reality underneath it all, the reasons people were leaving, the conditions they were leaving from, the risks they were taking to get here, was often buried beneath the noise. Those people weren't coming for adventure. They were coming for the same reasons the 49ers left Missouri. Because the life they were already living had stopped working. Because drought and organized violence and economic collapse, and the slow, grinding weight of having no realistic future where you are, had pushed them past the point where leaving felt more dangerous than staying. Because somewhere ahead of them, real or imagined, was the idea of a place where things might be better. A place where the odds, however long, were better than the ones right here. The parallel to 1850 isn't just thematic, it's structural. The technology differs, the geography is different, the legal frameworks, the countries of origin, all different. But the fundamental mechanism is identical. Desperate people leaving places that have stopped working for them, heading towards somewhere they mostly know through second-hand accounts and hopeful reports, often paying enormous sums to people profiting directly off their desperation. And the reception they find on arrival follows the same broad pattern it always has. Economic need, because the country they're entering has labour markets that absorb them. Cultural anxiety, because large-scale migration always generates it. Commercial exploitation, because desperate people have always been the most profitable market. And genuine human generosity, because that too is a consistent feature of how communities respond to newcomers, however unevenly it's distributed. Consider the information gap alone. In 1849, the newspapers of the East were printing the most optimistic possible accounts of California, systematically underreporting the death rate and the failure rate, because dramatic success stories sold papers and quiet failures did not. In 2023, the smuggling networks facilitating migration from Central and South America charge between $5,000 and $15,000 per person for passage. They market their services through WhatsApp and Facebook, with testimonials from people who made it. not from people who died in the Arizona desert, not from people who drowned in the Rio Grande, not from the ones who vanished somewhere in between. The same mechanism of selective information that sent 49ers into the Sierra Nevada with unrealistic expectations is operating today, just on a different platform, at a different price. The exploitation of arrival is another structural constant. Samuel Brannan made his fortune selling shovels to 49ers at extortionate prices. The contemporary equivalent is the entire industry of migration services, wire transfer fees, predatory lending, and financial products that cluster around immigrant communities at every income level, charging 5 to 10% for remittance transfers, offering loans at rates that make ordinary American financial products look generous, operating with a level of consumer protection oversight that ranges from minimal to non-existent. Desperate people have always been the most profitable market, because desperation impairs the ability to calculate alternatives. And here is the part of the parallel that sits most uncomfortably. The gold rush story, the 1849 migration, is one of the foundational myths of American national identity. It is celebrated. The 49ers are heroes, the risk-takers, the people who built California, the people who embody the American spirit of going west and starting over. Most of them were undocumented. They arrived in a territory that hadn't been a US state for a full year when the migration peaked, a territory with no functioning legal system, no established property rights, no immigration authority, no process for claiming any kind of status. They came from dozens of countries. Somewhere between a third and a half of the 49ers who arrived in California at the peak were not American citizens. Mexican nationals, Chinese nationals, Chileans, Australians, Frenchmen, Germans, and Irish who hadn't naturalized. They came anyway. They worked anyway. They built California anyway. The question of who gets to be celebrated as a desperate migrant chasing a dream in America, and who gets to be criminalized for the exact same act. The gold rush poses that question with uncomfortable clarity. Every generation of Americans has answered it differently, and every generation has been convinced its answer was the obvious and correct one. The economic dimension of the parallel is worth pausing on. The most significant thing about the California gold rush wasn't the gold itself. It was the demand that the human migration created for food, for shelter, for transportation, for services of every imaginable kind. The economies that absorbed the 49ers grew at rates that would have been impossible without them. That too has a contemporary parallel, one that rarely enters the political debate with the same emotional force as the images of people at a border crossing. But it's the personal dimension that makes the parallel feel real, because the specific feeling of the 1850 migrant, that mixture of terror and resolve, and the strange, complicated hope that comes from having burned your bridges behind you, that feeling isn't historical. It isn't past. It's happening right now, in the chest of every person who has loaded their family into a vehicle or a raft or a truck, and pointed it towards somewhere they've never been, toward a future that exists only as a promise someone may or may not have meant to keep. The 49ers answered the question of what you do when the life you're already living becomes untenable, and their answer, leave, was simultaneously an act of courage, desperation, rationality, and faith. It was also an answer that cost many of them far more than they expected. Whether it was worth it depended entirely on what they found, and what they found kept changing, not always in the direction they'd hoped. The letters that 49ers wrote home from California are one of the most remarkable records of ordinary American inner life from the entire 19th century. Not because they're always accurate, but precisely because of the gap between what they say and what was actually happening. Reading them alongside the private diaries kept by the same men, you can trace the specific shape of the self-deception the gold rush required of its participants, the ways hope was manufactured, maintained, and eventually exhausted. In the early months, the letters are almost uniformly bright. Gold is here, they say. I haven't found it yet, but men a few miles from my claim pulled $1,500 last week. I expect to do as well or better once the water drops. The camp is rough but improving. I'm in good health and good spirits. These letters weren't primarily written for the people receiving them. They were written for the men writing them, who needed to believe what they were putting on the page in order to keep going. By the second year, the tone shifts. The optimism is still there, but it's harder worked now. They're going to try a new location. They heard there was better ground on the South Fork. They're considering a partnership with some men from Ohio who have a more efficient setup. They're looking into another kind of work, just temporarily, while the claim rests. The gold is still there. It's just harder to reach than they expected. By the third year, for many of them, the letters stop entirely, and the silence of those stopped letters is itself a kind of testimony to the moment when a man runs out of optimistic things to say and can't bring himself to say the other things instead. A century and a half later, historians still haven't agreed on the basic question. Was the California gold rush good for America? The answer, of course, depends entirely on who you ask, and the range of perspectives, from 49er descendants to California native scholars, from economic historians to environmental scientists, maps out a moral landscape considerably more complicated than any national myth can comfortably hold. This isn't a question with a clean resolution. It's a question with a long trail of evidence, and a lot of people who've examined that evidence and arrived at very different conclusions. Understanding why they disagree is as important as understanding the facts themselves. Let's start with the economic case for the gold rush, because it is genuinely impressive. The gold extracted from California's mountains and rivers between 1848 and 1855, the peak years, totaled somewhere between $245 million and $300 million in mid-19th century value. In today's purchasing power, that's somewhere in the range of $8 to $10 billion of raw wealth added to the American economy in less than a decade. The downstream effects were even larger. The gold rush capitalized the development of California in a way that wouldn't have happened for decades otherwise. It funded the construction of San Francisco, Sacramento, Stockton, and dozens of smaller cities. It created the agricultural foundation of California's Central Valley. Those farms initially grew food to feed the miners. Eventually, they became one of the most productive agricultural systems on Earth, and they remain so today. The gold rush also funded much of the infrastructure that connected California to the rest of the country. The profits flowing from California trade helped capitalize the first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869. The political weight of California's rapidly growing population drove the railroad legislation that reshaped American transportation and economic geography for the next 100 years. California's wealth and population tilted the balance of the pre-Civil War United States in ways that were structurally significant to the Union's ability to sustain the conflict economically. Remove the gold rush from the timeline, and the subsequent history of this country looks genuinely different in ways that are difficult to fully calculate. This is the economic historian's argument. The gold rush was a massive net positive for American development, and its long-term consequences were largely constructive. On the numbers alone, that case is hard to dispute. Now here is the counter-argument, which is equally well supported by evidence. The gold rush destroyed what was probably the most biodiverse salmon fishery in North America. The hydraulic mining that replaced individual placer operations in the 1850s, using high-pressure water jets to blast entire hillsides into slurry, then running that slurry through sluice boxes to catch fine gold particles, deposited hundreds of millions of cubic yards of sediment into California's rivers. The Sacramento River system, which had supported some of the densest salmon runs on the continent, was choked with mining debris. The Yuba River near Marysville filled in so completely that its bed rose 40 feet above the surrounding farmland, causing catastrophic flooding that destroyed entire agricultural communities. In 1884, a federal court issued an injunction against hydraulic mining, one of the first major environmental rulings in American legal history, specifically because the damage to California's waterways was so extensive and so thoroughly documented that it could no longer be legally ignored. The environmental debt of the gold rush is still being paid. The mercury used to process gold, hundreds of thousands of pounds of it, introduced into river systems across the Sierra Nevada and the Sacramento Delta, remains in the sediments of California's rivers and bays today. It's a toxic legacy that has shaped fish consumption advisories, driven environmental remediation projects costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and continues to affect the health of California's aquatic ecosystems 170 years after the last hydraulic operation shut down. The racial legacy is equally complex and equally ongoing. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal legislation to restrict immigration based specifically on national origin and ethnicity, traces in a direct line back to the racial politics of the California goldfields. Chinese miners face systematic, legally sanctioned discrimination from the earliest years of the rush. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 was applied with particular force against Chinese workers, even though it nominally covered all non-American miners. Anti-Chinese violence in the camps was widespread, frequently lethal, and almost never prosecuted. The racism built into the structure of the California mining economy became the template for anti-Chinese legislation that shaped American immigration policy for 6 decades. There is also the question of what the gold rush did to the people who went. Working-age men who travelled to California in 1849 and 1850 had measurably shorter life expectancies than their counterparts who stayed home. The physical hardship, disease exposure, inadequate nutrition, and psychological strain produced biological damage that was real, even if it remained largely invisible in the triumphant telling. The dream had a cost written in bodies, and yet, and this is the part of the debate that makes it genuinely unresolvable, the people descended from 49ers tend to tell a different story. They tell stories of great-great-grandmothers who built boarding houses from nothing, of great-great-grandfathers who failed at gold and succeeded at something else, of families who arrived with empty pockets and, over generations, built something stable and real. The mythology isn't purely myth. There was genuine social mobility. There were genuine upward trajectories that would not have existed in the lives left behind, which makes the final question the hardest one. Whose success justifies whose suffering, and who gets to balance that ledger? The gold rush gave America California. Whether that was worth the price depends entirely on who paid it, and whether they had any say in paying it. That question doesn't resolve cleanly. It wasn't designed to. The parallel between 1850 and the present extends even into the specific experience of arrival, of what happens to the human body and mind when it finally reaches the place it has been moving toward for so long. The anticipation of arrival, it turns out, is often more vivid than the arrival itself. The dream is most intense at the moment before it's tested by reality. This is a documented psychological phenomenon. Researchers call it the arrival fallacy, the mistaken belief that reaching a desired destination will produce more lasting happiness or relief than it actually does. The 49ers felt it acutely. Men who had carried California in their minds for months during the trail found, upon arriving, that California looked like a lot of hard work and not much magic. The rivers were beautiful but cold. The camps were loud and dirty. The gold, when they found it, was satisfying for about a day, before the arithmetic of what they still needed reasserted itself. This isn't a story about disappointed dreamers. It's a story about the persistent, necessary recalibration of expectation to reality that defines every genuine experience of migration or transformation. The dream has to be large enough to justify the cost of going, but the dream is never exactly what's waiting on the other side. And the capacity to navigate that gap between the vision that drove you out the door and the reality that greets you when you arrive is the capacity that determines whether the whole thing was worth it or not. The 49ers who navigated that gap most successfully were the ones who could hold the dream loosely enough to let reality reshape it. Who could arrive in California and think, this isn't what I pictured, but what do I actually have here? And what can I actually build with it? That flexibility, the ability to release the specific form of a dream while holding on to its underlying purpose. That was the skill the trail taught, if it taught anything at all. On September 9th, 1850, California became the 31st state of the United States. The speed of that transition is almost incomprehensible by any modern standard. In January of 1848, California was Mexican territory. By September of 1850, less than 3 years later, it was a full American state. With elected senators, a constitutional government, and a population large enough and organized enough to have pushed through the entire statehood process at a pace that left the US Congress simultaneously impressed and politically overwhelmed. That speed was entirely a product of the gold rush. Without the migration of 1849 and 1850, California's path to statehood would have been measured in decades. With it, the territory leapt from a sparsely populated frontier to a politically functioning state, in roughly the time it takes a modern American infrastructure project to clear its environmental review. The sheer velocity of that transformation had no precedent in American history, and has had none since. The consequences of that velocity cascaded outward in ways that shaped the next century of American history, in ways that are only fully visible in retrospect. California's entry into the Union as a free state, slavery prohibited in its 1849 Constitution, drafted by delegates who understood the political weight of what they were writing, was a seismic event in a country already straining under the pressure of the slavery debate. That addition shifted the balance of free and slave states, forcing a political crisis that produced the Compromise of 1850, a set of legislative agreements that temporarily steadied the Union, but planted seeds of conflict that would erupt 11 years later at Fort Sumter. The gold rush contributed indirectly but materially to the chain of events that produced the Civil War. History is rarely made of straight lines, but it's almost always made of connections that become clear only after you know where the road ends. The Compromise of 1850 was a deeply contradictory piece of legislation. It admitted California as a free state, but simultaneously strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring citizens of free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. That provision outraged Northern abolitionists and sharply accelerated the polarization of the country along sectional lines. The gold rush had created the political necessity for the Compromise. The Compromise had created the conditions for the war that followed. The thread connecting a California river in January 1848 to a South Carolina artillery barrage in April 1861 is longer and more indirect than it first appears, but it is continuous. The more immediate long-term effect was a fundamental shift in where American economic power was concentrated. Before the gold rush, that power lived in the Northeast, the industrial cities of New England and the mid-Atlantic states, the banking centers of Boston and New York, the the textile mills and iron foundries making the United States an emerging industrial force. The Pacific coast was, economically speaking, barely on the map. California existed in American commercial consciousness primarily as a distant place that required a very long sea voyage to reach. After the gold rush, that changed permanently. California was capitalized, populated, and economically active in ways that made it a lasting and weighty part of the national landscape. The trade routes developed to supply the gold fields around Cape Horn, across the Isthmus of Panama, overland through the southwest, became permanent arteries of American commerce. The shipping companies that grew to serve California became the foundations of the American merchant fleet and Pacific trade. The San Francisco banking houses that emerged to handle gold rush capital became the financial institutions bankrolling the development of the entire American West for the following half-century. The agricultural transformation of California's Central Valley stands among the most consequential long-term effects of them all. The farms that grew food for the miners, wheat, vegetables, cattle ranches, expanded as gold petered out, filling the vacuum left by mining with an agricultural system that had no precedent in American scale or productivity. By the end of the 19th century, California's Central Valley was producing a significant fraction of the nation's fruit, vegetables, and grain. Today it produces roughly a quarter of America's food supply, irrigated by a water infrastructure system whose origins trace directly to engineering techniques developed by hydraulic gold miners, who were trying to solve a completely different problem. The legal structures California built in its first decade shaped the legal landscape of the entire American West. California's approach to mining law, establishing the principle that the first person to work a claim owned its productivity, a doctrine called prior appropriation, was adopted by virtually every Western state as they achieved statehood in the decades that followed. Applied to water rights, that same doctrine is still the governing legal principle for water allocation across the arid West today. Its consequences play out every week in news stories about drought, water scarcity, and the ongoing disputes between states competing for the same diminishing supply. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed at Promontory Summit, Utah in May 1869, was a direct consequence of the gold rush. The political pressure came from California interests wanting to connect their profitable and distant state to the eastern market. The financing came substantially from California capital and from federal land grants motivated by the imperative to bind the far state firmly to the Union. And the labor force that built the western portion, 60 to 80% of the Central Pacific's construction crews were Chinese immigrants, many of whom had originally come to California during or just after the rush, was a direct human legacy of the earlier migration. Those workers performed some of the most dangerous and technically demanding construction in American history, including the hand drilling and blasting of tunnels through the granite core of the Sierra Nevada. They were paid less than their white counterparts, housed separately, given the most hazardous assignments, and they were specifically excluded from the famous photograph taken at Promontory Summit, Utah, celebrating the railroad's completion. Their absence from that photograph is a small but perfectly legible summary of the pattern. The people whose labor made the building possible were systematically written out of the story as it was being celebrated. The consequences of 1849 are not history in any distant sense. They are the present tense of California and of America, expressed in water law and agricultural infrastructure and railroad rights of way, and the demographic patterns of a state that is today both the most economically productive and the most socially complex place in the country. The key the 49ers turned is still opening doors. There's one more dimension of the gold rush that historians have increasingly focused on in recent decades: what it did to California's landscape in ways that weren't reversible. The 49ers weren't thinking about ecological consequences. The concept barely existed in 1849, and the scale of what they were doing to the land wouldn't have been visible to any individual participant standing in it. But the cumulative effect of 100,000 people mining simultaneously in a relatively compact watershed was an environmental transformation that still shapes California's physical geography today. The Yuba River, to take the most dramatic example, carries more mercury in its sediments than almost any comparable waterway in North America. That mercury, introduced through the gold amalgamation process, which used liquid mercury to bind with fine gold particles for separation from the gravel, settled into riverbeds and floodplains over decades of mining and has remained there ever since. It moves through the food chain. It accumulates in fish tissue. It shapes, in quiet and largely invisible ways, the health of the communities and ecosystems that still depend on those waters. The topography itself was changed. Hydraulic mining moved so much earth that the elevation profile of the Sacramento River Valley was permanently altered. Hills that existed in 1848 no longer exist in the same form. Valleys that were once valleys are now filled with mining tailings to varying depths. The physical California of the present is not the physical California that existed before the gold rush. It's a landscape that was reworked by human hands at a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. And the reworking happened in the course of a single decade, faster than any subsequent human transformation of comparable size. This is part of the debt the gold rush left behind. Not just social, not just legal, not just economic, physical, written into the land itself, where it will remain long after the last person who remembers the 49ers is gone. By 1855, the California that Lucina Stanley Wilson had arrived in, chaotic, improvised, organized by nobody and invented by everyone, had already begun to look like something more permanent. The tent cities of the early camps had been replaced in many locations by actual towns with actual buildings, general stores with glass front windows, hotels with printed menus, newspapers with daily editions and strong editorial opinions, churches with steeples that caught the Sierra Nevada light on Sunday mornings in a way that looked almost biblical. Sacramento had a theatre. San Francisco had a dozen. The California that had been invented in a frantic, improvisational rush over just a few extraordinary years was solidifying into a place with its own character, a specific California character that was like nothing else in America, shaped by the particular combination of people who had arrived there and the particular circumstances that had forced them all to figure out how to live together in a place none of them had built. And the people in it had changed, fundamentally, permanently, in ways they sometimes couldn't fully describe, but that were visible to anyone who had known them before. Lucina Stanley Wilson's transformation was as complete as anyone's. The woman who had walked out of Missouri in April of 1849, exhausted, frightened, carrying children on a crossing she wasn't sure she could survive, had, by the mid-1850s, become a California businesswoman of genuine substance and confidence. She had built, lost, and rebuilt her operations twice. She had managed employees of several nationalities in a social environment that had no established norms for exactly what she was doing. She had navigated the predatory credit systems of the California economy, the violence and instability of the mining regions, and the particular challenge of operating as an independent businesswoman in a landscape that had almost no precedent for what she represented. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy in any grand sense, but she was independent, in a way that would have been essentially impossible for a woman of her background and circumstances back in the Missouri she had left behind. The gold rush hadn't given her gold. It had given her something she hadn't known she was looking for. Proof of her own capability. Proof that she could do things that were hard, things that were unprecedented, things that the life before the wagon had given her no reason to believe she was capable of. Proof that starting over was a skill you could develop, not a catastrophe you were simply subjected to. This transformation, the discovery of oneself as more capable than one had ever been told or had occasion to demonstrate, was one of the most consistent themes in the accounts that 49ers and their families left behind. Not all of them found gold. Very few found the fortune they had pictured. But a remarkably large number found, in the hardship of the trail and the chaos of California, a version of themselves that was more resilient, more adaptable, and more self-aware than the person who had walked out the front door. And they found it in a way that a comfortable life never could have produced. When you're thrown into a situation where everything is new and nothing works the way it used to, and the only resources you have are the ones you actually possess, you find out who you actually are, not who your community told you that you were, not who the social structures of your birth defined you as, who you actually are when everything familiar is stripped away. This is what the gold rush did to an entire generation of Americans. It threw them so far outside their previous experience that the old rules simply didn't apply. And what emerged when those people settled back into something resembling normal life, either in California or for the significant number who returned east back in their home states, was different from what had gone in, more flexible, less automatically bound by the expectations of birth and class and circumstance that had structured American life before the rush. California as a culture carries this inheritance to the present day, the willingness to reinvent, to start over, to risk the comfortable known for the uncertain possible. These aren't accidental features of California's character. They are the direct inheritance of the people who first settled it, amplified through every subsequent wave of migration the gold rush template inspired. The rush self-selected for exactly these traits. People willing to risk everything, driven enough and desperate enough to attempt a crossing most sensible people would decline, and those people built a place in their own image. The broader transformation of America was subtler, but equally real. The gold rush permanently altered what Americans believed was possible within a single lifetime. The people who went west and came back changed, enriched or depleted, but fundamentally different, brought with them a lived experience of radical transformation that challenged the assumption that life followed a fixed track determined by birth. If a Missouri farm wife could walk 2,000 miles and build a business from nothing, what else was possible? What other assumptions about fixed limits and predetermined ceilings were simply wrong? The established social institutions of the East felt this pressure, quietly and over time. The assumption that a man's father's trade was his trade, that his grandfather's social position was his ceiling. These were slowly destabilized by the evidence that California had produced people who had broken every one of those rules, and at least sometimes succeeded magnificently in what they built on the other side. The underlying American concept of starting over, of radical transformation through individual drive and willingness to risk, was profoundly shaped by the gold rush. Before 1849, the American promise was largely agrarian. Land ownership as the path to dignity and independence, the family farm as the unit of self-sufficiency and social standing. After 1849, a new possibility entered the national imagination. The rags-to-riches story that would come to define the Gilded Age had its prototype not in any single entrepreneur's biography, but in the collective experience of tens of thousands of ordinary people who went west and came back changed. But Louisiana sitting in California in the late 1870s when she finally wrote down her memoirs, was honest about what the change had cost. She wrote about the graves on the trail, names she still remembered decades later. People she had passed and mourned and thought about on ordinary days when the memory arrived without warning. She wrote about the floods, the fire, the exhaustion of rebuilding from nothing more than once. She wrote about the feeling of having been both more and less than she expected herself to be. And she wrote that she would do it again, not because it hadn't been hard, but because she had found out, irreversibly, who she was. The story of California's water law is particularly instructive because it represents one of the gold rush's most direct and consequential contributions to the legal architecture of the American West, and one that is now at the center of one of the West's most serious ongoing crises, the doctrine of prior appropriation, the legal principle establishing that the first person to use water from a natural source acquires a permanent right to that use, regardless of whether they own the land the water flows through, was invented in the California goldfields out of pure practical necessity. Miners needed to divert water to their claims, often from rivers and streams flowing through land they didn't own. They needed a legal principle that would protect their investment in the diversion infrastructure they'd built. Prior appropriation provided it. If you diverted the water first and used it consistently, it was yours. That principle was exported, almost unchanged, to every Western state that achieved statehood over the following half-century. Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, Colorado, Utah, Montana, Wyoming. All of them adopted prior appropriation as their governing water doctrine, because the California model was the most successful available, and because it encouraged the kind of investment in irrigation infrastructure that Western development required. Today, prior appropriation is at the center of the American West's water crisis. The doctrine was designed for a world of abundant water and expanding settlement, a world in which encouraging maximum use made economic sense. It was not designed for a world of declining snowpack, extended drought, and competing demands from cities, farms, and ecosystems. The legal framework the gold rush invented is now one of the primary obstacles to managing Western water sustainably. Prior appropriation rights are almost impossible to reduce without compensation, and the holders of the oldest rights have every legal incentive to continue using their full allocation, even when the water isn't there to support it. The 49ers who worked out prior appropriation in the California mining camps in 1849 and 1850 weren't thinking about the Sonoran Desert in 2025. They were thinking about who had the right to the water in the claim 50 feet upstream. But the principle they established in those local disputes became the legal infrastructure that 21st century America is now struggling to reform, inadequately and incompletely, as the consequences of a gold rush era water doctrine play out in a climate the doctrine never anticipated. The 49ers are long gone, but the decisions they made in the mud and the cold and the desperation of 1849 are still shaping the world we're living in today. There is a piece of wisdom embedded in the gold rush story that took a long time to surface, because it isn't the wisdom anybody was looking for at the time, and it isn't the wisdom the myth has ever claimed to offer. Everybody who went to California went for the gold. That was the stated purpose, the declared reason, the justification they gave their families and their creditors and themselves in those spring mornings when they loaded the wagon and said goodbye. Gold, enough to pay off the debt, to buy the farm back, to give the children a different kind of future, to make the years of difficulty finally add up to something. Gold was the goal. The trail was the price they were willing to pay to reach it. They paid that price. And most of them never reached the goal. But here is what the historical record shows, with a consistency that is almost eerie across thousands of individual accounts written over many decades. The people who found what they were actually looking for in California mostly didn't find it in the form of gold. The transformation that mattered, the thing that changed their lives in ways that lasted for the rest of those lives and echoed through the generations that followed, came from the trail itself, not the destination. The act of deciding to leave a life that wasn't working and move towards something unknown. The act of surviving a crossing that was considerably harder than advertised. The act of arriving somewhere the old rules didn't apply and being forced, without preparation or guidance, to invent new ones. The wisdom this offers isn't simply follow your dreams. That's too forgiving of real cost, too easily mistaken for permission to ignore the consequences of your choices. The wisdom is something more specific, more unsettling, and ultimately more useful. The pursuit of an impossible goal can transform you in ways that achieving it never would have. This isn't a motivational phrase, it's an observation drawn from a specific historical event, documented in the accounts of the people who actually lived through it. The 49ers who came back from California with little or no gold were not, by most meaningful measures, failures. They were changed. The experience of the trail, the California chaos, the forced adaptation, the stripped-away illusions about what life was and what it owed them. All of it produced people who'd been tested in ways their previous lives would never have demanded. And a remarkable number of them, in their later years, described the California experience not with bitterness about what they hadn't found, but with something closer to gratitude for what they had become in the process of searching for it. This isn't meant to romanticize the suffering. People died on that trail. People died in the camps from disease and accident, and the consequences of living too far past what the human body can sustain. People lost years of their lives and every dollar they had, and came home broken in ways that were real, and in some cases permanent. The cost was not a metaphor. It was a specific, physical, measurable price paid by specific individuals who didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to when they pointed the wagon west. But the pattern in the survivor accounts, the ones who came back and lived long enough and clearly enough to write about it, suggests something genuinely interesting about the relationship between a stated goal and actual growth, between the thing you said you were going for and the thing you actually found. The men and women who arrived at the gold fields with a single, fixed, narrowly defined purpose, get gold, come home, tended to be the ones most completely devastated when the gold didn't materialize. They had defined success so narrowly that anything short of it felt like total failure. And total failure was what most of them met. The ones who adapted, who arrived, assessed the reality in front of them rather than the dream they'd carried across the continent, and shifted toward whatever they could actually do in this specific place at this specific moment, tended to have outcomes that were richer. Not always financially richer, but they built things. They learned things about themselves and about the world. They became people with a broader range of skills and experiences and self-knowledge than they'd had when they left, and that depth served them for the rest of their lives in ways that any amount of gold, simply handed to them at the start, never could have produced. Lucina Stanley Wilson never found gold. She made biscuits, then she built a hotel from a plank table and a cook tent. Then she built it again after the flood. Then she built it again after the fire. The goal she had arrived with, a better life for her family, was eventually achieved, but not through the means anyone had specified when the wagon left Missouri. The dream survived the collapse of the plan because she was willing to let the plan fail, without letting the underlying need fail with it. This pattern, the goal surviving the collapse of the original path to reach it, is one of the most consistent threads running through the Gold Rush accounts, and it carries a practical wisdom that reaches well beyond 1849 and well beyond California. The clarity that comes from desperation, it turns out, can be a kind of gift. When you've left everything behind, the original plan has failed, and you're standing in a mining camp with nothing in your pan and the full knowledge that going back isn't really an option. In that moment, you see your own resources with a clarity that comfort never produces and that security never requires. You see what you can actually do, not what you imagined you could do before you were tested, what you demonstrably actually possess, in the plain terms of what you can accomplish in difficult circumstances when the stakes are real. The gold rush revealed to its participants what they were actually made of, not what the newspapers had promised they could become, not what the mythology said they were made of, what they actually were, tested against reality. And the part of that wisdom that still cuts. Most of them didn't know what they were made of before they went. They had to leave home to find out. The life they'd been living, bounded by familiarity, shaped by expectations, limited by an imagination that comes from never having been seriously tested, hadn't given them that information. They had to go west to get it, and once they had it, they couldn't give it back. One of the most striking features of Lucina Stanley Wilson's memoir, written in her old age and dictated to her daughter who transcribed it, is the specificity of her memory for prices. She remembered decades later exactly what she had charged for meals at different points in her California career, what she had paid for supplies, what she had earned in good months and lean ones. This specificity is not incidental. It's the memory of a woman who had understood, early and clearly, that survival in the California economy required an almost mathematical relationship with the flow of money in and out of her operation, in an environment where prices shifted weekly, where credit was freely extended and freely abused, where a man could owe you 3 months of board and then vanish in the night to try his luck on a different tributary. The ability to keep accurate mental accounts and act on them promptly was the difference between a business that survived and one that quietly evaporated. Lucina kept those accounts. She had the particular financial clarity of a woman who had managed a household on insufficient resources for years before California, who had learned to make the arithmetic of not enough work through careful attention to every dollar in and every dollar out. This wasn't unusual among the women who built enterprises in the gold rush era. The financial capabilities that women had been exercising for years, unrecognized, uncompensated, inside the domestic economy of American households, the budgeting, the rationing, the careful management of limited resources, transferred with remarkable directness to the commercial economy of a boomtown. The skills were the same skills. The scale was different, the recognition was new, and the combination, for women willing to make the leap from household manager to commercial operator, was often surprisingly successful. California rewarded competence, not always, not without also rewarding connections, timing, luck and circumstances that competence had nothing to do with. But more than any Eastern economy of the same era, it rewarded what you could actually do in ways that crossed the usual lines of class, gender, and origin. Lucina understood this from her first morning of selling biscuits, and she built a life on that understanding. There is a particular way that Americans talk about themselves that you don't fully notice until you've spent time thinking about where it comes from. It's a story about motion, a story about the person who left and built something new somewhere else. The immigrant ancestor who crossed an ocean, the family that headed west in a covered wagon, the great-grandparent who walked away from a failing farm and started over in a city, the parent who left a place that wasn't working and tried somewhere different, somewhere better, somewhere possible. Motion, reinvention, the willingness to leave what isn't working and find something that does. These are so deeply woven into the American self-concept that they function less as a cultural value and more as a collective autobiography. This is what we believe we are, at the level below conscious thought. The gold rush didn't create this story. The first English settlers who crossed the Atlantic in the early 17th century were already living it. The Pilgrims were migrants. The Puritans were migrants. The Scotch-Irish who filled the Appalachian backcountry in the 18th century were migrants. The founding mythology of America is itself a migration story. People who found the existing arrangements unacceptable and moved somewhere they could arrange things differently, even if arranging things differently came at a price nobody fully disclosed before departure. But the gold rush amplified this story in ways that made it visible and legible to an entire generation at once. Unlike the gradual migrations of previous centuries, it was a simultaneously experienced national moment. People all over the country made the same basic decision at roughly the same time, in response to the same news, driven by overlapping versions of the same desperation. The shared quality of that choice, the fact that your neighbour was going, that the young man from the next county was going, that your brother-in-law's cousin had already sent a letter from Sacramento, gave the migration a feeling of collective action. It felt like America expressing something essential about its own nature. We are a people who leave when things don't work. We are a people who bet on the possible at the expense of the certain. We are a people who believe, sometimes rationally, sometimes through a faith that outstrips the evidence, that the next place, the next beginning, the next attempt will be the one that finally delivers on what we were promised. This belief is a genuine source of strength. The American capacity for reinvention, for walking away from a failed enterprise and starting another without the kind of shame that would stop people in more rigid societies from trying again, has produced an economic and cultural energy that is real, documented, and has no precise equivalent elsewhere in the developed world. The willingness to fail, dust off, and try again is genuinely American in ways that go beyond comfortable cliché. But this same belief is also a source of genuine dysfunction, one the national mythology has never been entirely comfortable examining. The stories we tell about the people who left, the 49ers, the pioneers, the immigrants, tend overwhelmingly to be triumph narratives. They feature people who departed and built something remarkable somewhere else. The people who left and found nothing, who went to California and came back broken or poorer or simply unchanged, who took the gamble and lost. Those stories don't get the same place in the national memory. They get at most a footnote. And the selective celebration of the leaver who succeeded creates a culture with a complicated and largely unexamined relationship to failure. The decision to stay, to work a struggling farm another season and see if the soil could be coaxed back, to remain in a difficult place and build something where you are rather than chasing something somewhere else. That rarely gets celebrated in the American story. And yet staying is often the harder choice. It requires a kind of courage that isn't legible, as courage in a culture that has decided movement is the primary expression of will and ambition. The people who didn't go to California in 1849, who watched their neighbours leave and planted the next season's crop anyway, who stayed and managed and endured and kept the towns and families and institutions functioning during the years the mobile departed, their stories are largely lost, not because they were unimportant, but because they didn't generate the kind of dramatic narrative that history tends to preserve. Endurance is harder to tell as a story than adventure. Staying tends to have fewer chapters worth dramatizing, even when it demands more genuine courage. There is also, embedded in the gold rush, a quiet question about what we owe each other when we leave. The 49ers left behind towns that lost their most economically mobile people, towns that struggled for years to maintain the institutions and community bonds those people had once supported. They left behind families who waited for letters that sometimes never came, who managed on reduced circumstances, who made their own quiet accommodations to absence in ways nobody was recording. They left behind, in many cases, debts and obligations and social bonds that departure made impossible to honour. The idea of individual reinvention, taken too far and without accountability, produces people who confuse freedom for themselves with indifference to everyone around them. The most honest reading of the Gold Rush story, the one that holds all of its complexity without flinching, isn't a celebration of individual courage, and it isn't a condemnation of collective recklessness. It's a portrait of a country in the middle of defining itself through the messiest possible medium. 100,000 simultaneous personal crises playing out across 2,000 miles of continental geography, with no script and no guarantee. We are the inheritors of all of it, not just the triumph, not just the parts that photograph well. The whole thing, the courage and the desperation, the exploitation and the destruction, the adaptation and the rebuilding, the graves on the trail and the businesses rebuilt after the flood. We're made of all of it, an understanding that makes us more honest about who we actually are, and more prepared to recognize the pattern when it arrives again in a different form. And who we actually are is a people who have been leaving and arriving and building and losing and starting over for as long as we've been a people. The 49ers didn't invent that, but they dramatized it at a scale and speed that lodged it permanently in the American imagination, in a shape that every subsequent generation has had to reckon with. That story doesn't end in 1850. It didn't end the day California achieved statehood, or the day the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, or any of the other ceremonial moments that history uses to mark its chapters. It hasn't ended yet, which is exactly why the question of where it goes next is the only question worth ending on. The wisdom the Gold Rush offers about desperation and growth has a darker corollary, one that is equally important to acknowledge. The same crucible that revealed capability in some people revealed its absence in others, and that revelation was not gentle. Some men who went to California and failed didn't come back transformed. They came back diminished. The trail had broken something in them that didn't heal. The years of effort without return had produced not resilience, but a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. Something that modern psychology would recognize as the accumulated weight of chronic stress on a nervous system that had simply exceeded its capacity. The specific combination of sustained physical hardship, financial failure, social isolation, and the psychological burden of having bet everything and lost. This could produce damage that lasted for years after California. Damage that showed up in shortened working lives, in chronic health problems, in family relationships strained by absence and disappointment. These men are the missing half of the Gold Rush story, the ones the triumph narrative has no room for. Their names appear in county records and census data as men who returned to their home states with no visible assets, and died earlier than the neighbours who had simply stayed. They're there in the historical record if you look for them, and they're there in significant numbers. The wisdom the Gold Rush actually offers isn't that hardship automatically produces growth. It's that the potential for growth lives within hardship, potential that some people realise and some people don't, depending on temperament and support and prior experience and simple luck, in proportions that nobody can specify in advance for any particular person. This is a more honest wisdom than the triumph narrative allows, and it's a more useful one, because it names the risk alongside the possibility, rather than pretending the risk was never there. The gold in California's rivers is not gone. There are still traces of it. In the gravel bars of the Yuba and the Feather and the American River, in the deep ancient channels that geologists call blue leads, prehistoric riverbeds that once ran at different angles across the Sierra Nevada landscape before the mountains finished lifting and the drainage pattern shifted. The hydraulic miners of the 1850s couldn't reach the deepest of these. They knew the gold was there. They could calculate where it had to be, given how the surface deposits distributed. But the technology and the capital to reach it weren't available. Some of it is still down there, waiting in the dark beneath the modern riverbed, untouched since the Pleistocene deposited it. Weekend prospectors still work the accessible stretches. They drive up into the Sierra Nevada foothills on Saturday mornings, set up their equipment in the same rivers the 49ers worked, and spend the day searching. Most find almost nothing of monetary value. Some find a little, enough to encourage the next trip. Very occasionally somebody finds something significant enough to generate a story that circulates through the prospecting community for years. Ask them why they do it, and the answers sound remarkably familiar. They talk about the quiet of the river, that particular, specific quiet that exists where water moves over stone and the rest of the world seems to recede into the distance. They talk about the way time moves differently when you're standing in cold water with your hands in the gravel, how an hour can feel like 20 minutes and simultaneously like its own complete world. They talk about the feeling of being connected to something that happened a long time ago, of working the same material with the same basic tools, of standing in the same physical spot where someone else stood 170 years earlier, carrying the same complicated mixture of hope and uncertainty. And they talk about the possibility, not the probability. Almost none of them are naive enough to expect to get rich. The possibility, the knowledge that what they're looking for is actually there, somewhere in the gravel, even if most days it doesn't reveal itself. What they're describing isn't really gold prospecting. It's the maintenance of a certain relationship with the possible, a practice of continuing to look for something in a landscape that mostly doesn't give it up, and finding meaning in the looking itself, not just in the finding. The act of reaching into cold water and not knowing what's there, and doing it anyway, as an end in itself. This is a very old American habit. It predates the gold rush. It predates the country. But the gold rush codified it, dramatized it at a scale that lodged it permanently in the national imagination, gave it a mythology and an identity and a shape it still holds today. We are a country of people who believe the gold is still there, not literally, not most of us, not standing in a river on a Saturday morning, but the specific California-born conviction that the next attempt might be the one, that the next move might produce what the last one didn't, that the particular combination of effort and timing and willingness to leave your comfort zone might, this time, finally add up to something. That conviction is so deeply embedded in American life that it functions less as a conscious belief and more as a reflex. It's in the startup culture of Silicon Valley, which sits on the same California geography the 49ers once crossed. It's in the promise that every election cycle makes, that this time, this approach, will finally deliver what was promised to the people still waiting. Consider what that means for the generations now making their own versions of the 49ers gamble, the young person leaving a hometown that doesn't hold a future, heading to a city where the cost of living is terrifying, but the possibility of becoming something feels real. The immigrant family crossing a desert or a river or an ocean for reasons that would sound, to Lucina Stanley Wilson, entirely and immediately recognizable. The mid-career professional walking away from a stable but suffocating situation, towards something undefined, risky, and maybe possible. The entrepreneur loading everything into a van and driving toward a city they've never lived in, to build something that doesn't exist yet. Every one of them is working the same gravel the 49ers worked, with different tools in a different landscape for a different version of the same dream, and the percentage who will find exactly what they're looking for is probably not all that different from the percentage of 49ers who found gold in California, which means most of them will find something different from what they went looking for. Which means the question isn't whether they'll find the gold. The question is whether they'll have the resourcefulness, the Lucina Stanley Wilson resourcefulness, built from biscuits and flooded kitchens and fires and rebuilt plank tables, to recognize the thing they find as valuable, even when it isn't what they came for. Whether they'll have the flexibility to let the original plan fail without letting the original need fail with it. Whether they'll be able to stand in a California they didn't expect, holding something that looks nothing like what they pictured, and understand that it might be enough, that it might in fact be more than enough, that the finding out was all along the thing they were actually going after, even if they didn't have the language for it when they left. There is a version of this story that is very sad. In that version, the gold rush is a parable about the way desperate people can be driven by manufactured hope into catastrophic risk, exploited by those positioned to profit from their desperation, and abandoned by a myth that served everyone's interests except the people living it from the inside. That version is true. There is another version that is something closer to awe. In that version, the gold rush is what happens when 100,000 ordinary people, pushed to their limits by circumstances largely outside their control, discover that the limits aren't where they thought they were. That version is also true. The two versions live inside each other, inseparable, the way the gold lives inside the gravel, not visible on the surface, requiring patient and often cold and often unrewarded work to find, and always more complicated and more layered than it looks at first. In the spring of 1849, a woman in Missouri loaded 2 children into a wagon and pointed it west. Because she had run out of other options, she arrived in California with nothing except the knowledge earned across 2,000 miles of the hardest road on the continent, past the graves and the flood crossings and the mountain passes, that she was more capable than she had known, that the life before the wagon had not told her the truth about herself. She didn't find gold, she found out who she was, and in the end the countries and the centuries and the rivers all change. But that particular, irreplaceable, unglamorous, irreversible discovery is what every person who has ever left a known life for an unknown one was actually going after, whether they could name it or not, whether the gravel gave it up or not, whether the gold was ever really there at all. The key is still on the kitchen table, the wagon is still pointing west, and somewhere in the river, just below the surface of ordinary things, the water is running cold and clear, over stones that have been patient for a very long time. The gold rush also produced one of the most interesting social experiments in American history, almost entirely by accident. The construction of a functioning multi-ethnic community under conditions of absolute necessity, in a place where none of the usual social hierarchies had been established, and none of the usual mechanisms for enforcing them were fully operational. The California mining camps of 1849 and 1850 contained people from more different national, ethnic, linguistic and cultural backgrounds than almost any other place in the world at that time. Americans from every state, Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese, French, German, Australian, Hawaiian, Irish, all of them living in proximity, all of them needing to function in a shared economic and social space, all of them working out day by day how to do that in the complete absence of any established framework. The result was messy, often violent, frequently unjust, particularly toward ethnic minorities who lacked the political power to protect themselves from the racism of the numerical majority. But it was also, in the intervals between injustice, a kind of laboratory for the management of difference. that American society would spend the next century and a half trying to get right in more deliberate and self-conscious ways. The men who came back from California having worked alongside Chinese miners, having traded with Mexican merchants, having been treated by a French doctor in a camp hospital. They came back with a relationship to human difference that was more complicated than simple prejudice, even when prejudice remained present alongside it. They had seen Chinese miners work with extraordinary skill and discipline. They had eaten food prepared by a Mexican cook that was considerably better than anything they'd tasted back in Ohio. They had encountered, in the specific, concrete terms of daily life, people who were different from them and who had something to teach them. That encounter didn't eliminate racism. It didn't produce justice, but it complicated the neat categories that racism requires in ways that were difficult to fully unlearn. The key is still on the table, the river is still running, and the story is still being written. In 1850, people left everything they had ever known for a dream printed on a rumour. Some found gold, most found something harder, and kept going anyway. That kind of quiet courage is worth remembering. Bedtime Sleepy is glad you stayed for it. Close your eyes now, you've earned your rest.